The Yukon Territory, the smallest and most western of Canada's territories, is filled with an abundance of wildlife set amongst vast alpine forests, glacial lakes, and rugged valleys. Since the 1980s, bison have been reintroduced to the area. From just 150 individuals and the brink of extinction, their numbers have grown to more than 10 times that. Although they are an iconic species and one that is recognized the world over, for the First Nations who live off the land, their reintroduction was not necessarily regarded as a good thing. They were concerned that their rise in numbers could cause detrimental damage to the ecosystem. Now, to keep numbers down, hunters are allowed to harvest bison in the Yukon Territory. First Nation and settler locals are entitled to hunt bison for cultural reasons, whereas visitors have to obtain licenses. Hunting season starts on the 1st of September each year and runs through the fall and winter months. As the COVID-19 pandemic was gripping the world, places like the Yukon saw an increase in hunters heading to the wilderness. People were desperate to get out and about in less populated areas, making the most of the open space with fewer restrictions. The Yukon wilderness is exactly where husband and wife Terry and Megan Still were headed with their friend Delaney on September 5, 2020. They had decided on a hunting trip over a long weekend. It was the break they needed from their busy lives, and the countryside was perfect. They made their way to Champaign, located on the Alaska Highway, for the start of their adventure. But little did they know what sort of tragic adventure it was going to be. An hour outside Whitehorse, the three friends were locked and loaded, tracking bison in the wilds. They had arrived the day before and were prepared to spend the whole weekend hunting the animals. It was the thrill of the chase, the expert marksmanship, and being in the great outdoors that they enjoyed the most during a hunt. But things were about to go seriously wrong. On that Saturday morning, they parked their all-terrain vehicle and set out on foot. Up ahead was a glade, an opening in the forest where they were sure they would find a bison. It was their perfect habitat, close to the safety of the trees, yet grassland on which they could graze. Silently, the three of them walked through the conifers, treading carefully over the forested floor. As the trees opened out into a clearing, they spotted it, a lone bison. Its head was down as it grazed the lush green grass. Its broad shoulders formed a powerful hulk of muscle above the head. Its curved horns protruded from its thick fur. The three hunters had a clean shot. They stood still, watching the impressive animal for a few moments before preparing their weapons. Terry and Delaney then raised their rifles and stared down the scope. Although their hearts were racing, they slowed their breathing and focused their sights on the bison. When the weapon was ready, they each pulled the trigger. Two loud cracks rang out, the sound echoing through the woodland, and the bison instantly fell to the ground. It looked like a clean shot. Delaney began walking back to their vehicle to bring it closer to collect the carcass, whilst Terry walked over to their kill. Megan followed closely behind him. He clutched his rifle, keeping his eyes on the animal. He thought he saw its chest heaving up and down, but wasn't sure, so he continued to approach it. The two of them had secured 2 shots into the beast. There was no way it was getting back up. Or was there? The tall grass rustled as Terry walked through it. Cautiously, he came within feet of the bison. Its ears twitched, and in an instant it lifted its head. To Terry's horror, the bison rolled onto its front and climbed to its feet. Terry was now just feet from the towering bison. It had sprung back to life, and the two were now staring each other in the eyes. With the tree line too far away, there was nowhere for Terry to hide. He was trapped. The bison's tail stood on end. Its head was bowed, and its horns directed right at Terry. It snorted angrily and ran at him, covering the ground between them in less than a second. Terry was taken completely off guard. The animal had gone from lying perfectly still to a full-on charge right before his eyes. Terry instinctively raised his rifle and shot at it 2 more times, but the bison kept coming. He had nowhere to go, as there was no way he could outrun it. Running at a top speed of 35 miles per hour, bison can outrun a horse. On top of that, their enormous size, standing over 6 feet at the shoulder, weighing almost a ton, makes them a formidable presence. Terry could feel the vibrations of the galloping hooves thundering across the open ground. His heart was in his mouth, and at the last second he tried to dive out of the way, but it was no use. Moments later, the bison struck him in the chest. Megan watched in horror as her husband was sent flying through the air. He flipped twice before landing heavily on his back in a crumpled mess amongst the long grass. But the bison wasn't finished with him yet. It ran over to him, and Megan screamed as the bison gored him repeatedly. Delaney heard the commotion and came running back to the clearing. He ran towards Terry and the bison, but it all happened so quickly. Before he could lift his rifle, the bison drove its horns into Terry, inflicting excruciating damage in his chest and side. Terry cried out and tried to push the animal off him, but it was too powerful. It shook its head from side to side. The force from the hit had broken bones and caused deep bruising, and now the horns sliced open skin and muscle. As Terry lay there on his back, he was exposed and at the mercy of the enormous beast. He couldn't roll over to protect himself. Instead, he had to endure the might of the bison. But after what seemed like an eternity, the bison lifted its head and stepped backwards. It stumbled 100 meters from where Terry lay and collapsed on the ground. It had succumbed to the rifle shots and now lay still in the clearing. Megan and Delaney rushed to Terry's side. He was barely conscious. Blood poured from his open wounds, and they tried to stem the bleeding. The walk back to the ATV was far, and they were in the middle of the wilderness. Help was a long way away. As Megan and Delaney tried to move Terry, he took his last breath and fell silent. There was nothing they could do. Terry was gone. His death had been the first ever recorded by a bison in the Yukon territory. Although people had been injured by the animals before, no one had ever died from an attack. Friends of Terry set up a GoFundMe page, hoping to raise money to support his family. He and his wife ran a business from home. In an instant, the financial security he provided for the family had been taken away. He was just 43 years old, a young man in his prime. When news broke of the tragedy, people were shocked. The First Nation community had been concerned about the conflicts between the ever-growing population of bison and themselves for some time, but their concerns had largely been ignored. Now someone had lost their life to one. Although bison are prey animals and typically not aggressive towards humans, they are territorial and protective of their young. If they feel threatened, then they don't hesitate to charge. In North America, particularly in Yellowstone National Park, tourists can fall victim to an attack if they get too close and do not respect the distance between themselves and the bison. People are advised to keep at least 75 feet away from bison and to turn and walk the other way if they come across them in their path. In Terry's case, the bison was injured and was fighting for its survival. Its instinct was to defend itself against a threat, and it did so until its last breath, shortly after Terry Still's terrifying final affliction.